Hello everyone and welcome back. This is part 4 of the series on Babylonians and Assyrians, their lives and their culture, all those nice little things. This is chapter 5 of the work. It deals first with agriculture and then a little bit about manners and customs. It ought to be pretty interesting, don't you think? As always, give it a like and subscribe, and if you want to follow along with the series, you'll have to just hit the bell button, won't you? Ding ding. Now, without further ado, let's get nice and relaxed, and we can begin. Oh, and there's always a link to this work in the description, and probably the pinned comment if you want to follow along. Now, let's really begin. Chapter 5, Manners and Customs. Babylonia was a land of bricks. Stone was not found nearer than the mountains of Elam on one side or the desert plains of northern Arabia on the other. Clay, on the contrary, was plentiful, and the art of making bricks and building a house by the means of them must have been invented by the first settlers in this country. The bricks were dried in the sun, the heat of which was sufficient to harden them. The clay was further bound together by being mixed with chopped reeds, though the use of the latter was not universal. At all events, in earlier times at least. In the later days of Babylonian history, however, they were generally employed, and we learn from the contracts that a bed of reeds grown for the sake of the brickmaker's trade was by no means an unprofitable investment. Either clay or bitumen took the place of mortar. The bitumen was procured from Hit or from the Kurdish hills, where there are still springs of naphtha. After the conquest of Canaan, it must have been brought from the neighborhood of the Dead Sea. Some scholars have thought that this is referred to by Gudea, the priest-king of Lagash, around 2700 BC. The employment of brick had a very direct effect on the character of Babylonian architecture. Thick walls, supported by buttresses, and devoid of sculpture, were necessitated by it. The buildings of Babylonia were externally plain and flat. Masses of brick were piled up in the form of towers, or else built into long lines of wall of unbroken monotony. The roofs were made of stems of palm trees, which rested on the stems of other palm trees, where the space between one brick wall and another was too great to be safely spanned. The upright stems became columns, which were imitated first in brick and then in stone. Babylonia was thus the birthplace of columnar architecture, and in the course of centuries, columns of almost every conceivable shape and every conceivable kind came to be invented. Sometimes they were made to stand on the backs of animals. Sometimes the animal formed the capital. The column which rested against the wall passed into a brick pilaster, and this again assumed various forms. The monotony of the wall itself was disguised in different ways. The pilaster served to break it, and the walls of the early Chaldean temples are accordingly broken up into series of recessed panels, the sides of which are formed by square pilasters. Clay cones were also inserted into the wall, and brilliantly colored, the colors being arranged in patterns. But the most common form of decoration was where the wall was covered with painted stucco. This, indeed, was the ordinary mode of ornamenting the internal walls of a building. A sort of dado ran round the lower part of them painted with the figures of men and animals, while the upper part was left in plain colors or decorated only with rosettes and similar designs. Ezekiel refers to the figures of the Chaldeans portrayed in vermilion on the walls of their palaces, and the composite creatures of Babylonian mythology, who were believed to represent the first imperfect attempts at creation, were depicted on the walls of the Temple of Bel. Among the tablets which have been found at Tello are plans of the houses of the age of Sargon of Akkad. The plans are for the most part drawn to scale, and the length and breadth of the rooms and courts contained in them are also given. The rooms opened one into the other, and along one side of the house there usually ran a passage. One of the houses, for example, of which we have a plan, contained 5 rooms on the ground floor, 2 of which were the length of the house. The dimensions of the second of the house is described as being 8 cubits in breadth and 1 gardu in length. Now, the gardu was probably equivalent to 18 cubits, or about 30 feet. In another case, the plan is that of the house of the high priest of Lagash, and at the back of it the number of slaves living in it. It is stated as well as the number of workmen employed to build it. It was built, we are told, in the year when Naram-Sin, the son of Sargon, made the pavement of the temples of Bel at Nippur and of Ishtar at Nin-Unu. The temple and house were alike erected on a platform of brick or earth. This was rendered necessary by the marshy soil of Babylonia and the inundations to which it was exposed. The houses, indeed, generally found the platform already prepared for them by the ruins of the buildings which had previously stood on the same spot. Sun-dried brick quickly disintegrates, and a deserted house soon became a mound of dirt. In this way, the villages and towns of Babylonia gradually rose in height, forming a tell, or mound, on which the houses of a latter age could be erected. In contrast to Babylonia were the younger kingdom of Assyria, and that was a land of stone. But the culture of Assyria was derived from Babylonia, and the architectural fashions of Babylonia were accordingly followed, even when the stone took the place of brick. The platform, which was as necessary in Babylonia as it was unnecessary in Assyria, was nevertheless servilely copied, and palaces and temples were piled upon it like those of the Babylonians. The ornamentation of the Babylonian walls was imitated in stone, the rooms being adorned with a sculpted dado, the bas-reliefs of which were painted in bright colors. Even the fantastic shapes of the Babylonian columns were reproduced in stone. Brick, too, was largely used. In fact, the stone served for the most part merely as a facing, to ornament rather than strengthen the walls. The Babylonian princes had themselves set the example of employing stone for the sake of decoration. Stone was fetched, for the purpose, from the most distant of regions, regardless of the cost. Gudea, the priest-king of Lagash, imported limestone from Lebanon and from Samalum, near the Gulf of Antioch, while the statues which adorned his palace and are now in the Louvre Museum are carved out of diorite from the peninsula of Sinai. The diorite doubtless came by sea, but the blocks of hewn stone were brought from the land of the Amorites and they must have been conveyed over land. Even more precious materials than stone were used for decorative purposes. Gold, silver, bronze, ivory, lapis lazuli, and colored glass ornamented the cornices of other parts of the interiors of the palace. Gudea tells us that he had sent to the deserts which bordered on Egypt for gold dust and acacia wood, to Arabia for copper, and to Mount Hermanus for beams of cedar. The elephant was still hunted on the banks of the Euphrates near the city of Carchemish, and lapis lazuli was furnished by the mountains of Persia. A garden was planted by the side of the house. The Babylonians were an agricultural people after all, and even the cities were full of gardens attached to the houses, of all who could afford to have them at least. Originally the garden was little more than a grove of palms, but herbs and vegetables soon began to grow in it, and as habits of luxury increased, exotic trees and shrubs were transplanted to it, and flowers were cultivated, just for the sake of the scent. Tiglath-Pileser I of Assyria tells us how he had, I quote, taken and planted in the gardens of his country cedars and other trees from the lands he had conquered, which none of the kings, his predecessors, had ever planted before. And also how he brought rare vines which did not exist in Assyria, and had cultivated them in the land of Assyria. At a later date, Sennacherib laid out a pleasure garden, or paradise, by the side of a palace he erected, filling it with cypresses and other trees as well as fragrant plants, and digging a lake in the midst of it by means of which it could be watered. One of the bas-reliefs in the palace of Ashurbanipal represents the king and queen dining in the royal garden under the shadow of its palms, while an attendant drives away the insects with a fan. The Assyrians did but imitate their Babylonian neighbors, and in the gardens of Nineveh we must see many copies of the gardens that had been laid out in Babylonia long ages before. The very word paradise, which in the Persian age came to signify a pleasure park, was of Babylonian origin. It is given in the exercise book of a Babylonian schoolboy as the name of a mythical locality, and an etymological pun attempts to derive it from the name of the god Esu. It was, of course, only the houses of the rich and the noble which were artistically furnished or provided with a garden at all. The poorer classes lived in mud huts of conical forms, which seldom contained more than one, or if they were lucky, 2 rooms. Air and light were admitted through the door or small apertures in the walls. In the better class of houses, on the other hand, the windows were of large size and were placed near the ceiling. The air was excluded by means of curtains which were drawn across them when the weather was cold or when it was necessary to keep out the sunlight. The houses, moreover, consisted of more than 1 story, the upper stories being approached by a flight of steps which were open to the air. They were usually built against one of the sides of a central court, around which the rooms were ranged, the rooms of the upper floors communicating with one another by means of a covered corridor, or else by doors leading from one chamber to another. The apartments of the women were, of course, separate from those of the men, and the servants slept either on the ground floor or in an outbuilding of their own. The furniture, even of the palaces, was scanty from a modern point of view. The floor was covered with rugs, for the manufacture of which Babylonia was famous. The chairs, couches, and tables were placed thereabout, here and there. The furniture was artistic in form. A sealed cylinder of the age of Ur-Bao, the king of Ur, the older contemporary of Gudea, represents a chair, the feet of which have been carved into the likeness of those of oxen, if we may judge from the Egyptian analogies of the material of which they were formed. Well, it would have probably been ivory. The Assyrian furniture of latter days doubtless followed older Babylonian models, and we can gain from it some idea of what they must have been like. The chairs were of various kinds. Some had backs, some had arms, some were mere stools. The seats of many were so high that a footstool was required by those who used them. The employment of the footstool must go back to a considerable antiquity, since we find some of the Tel el Amarna correspondence in the 14th century, before our era, comparing themselves to the footstool of the king. Chairs and stools alike were furnished with cushions, which were covered with embroidered tapestries. So also were the couches and bedsteads used by the wealthier classes. The poor? They contented themselves with a single mattress laid upon the floor, and since everyone slept in the clothes he had worn during the day, rising in the morning was not really a difficult task. The tables had 4 legs, and of the wood of which they were composed was often inlaid with ivory. Wood inlaid with ivory and other precious materials was also employed for the chairs and sofas. Tripods of bronze, moreover, stood in different parts of the room, and vases of water or wine were placed upon them. Fragments of some of them have been found in the ruins of Nineveh, and they are represented in early Babylonian seals. The feet of the tripod were artistically shaped to resemble the feet of oxen, the clinched human hand, or some similar design. At meals, the tripod stood beside the table on which the dishes were laid. Those who eat sat on chairs in the earlier period, but in later times the fashion grew up, for the men at any rate, to recline on a couch. Ashurbanipal, for example, is thus represented, while the queen sits behind him on a more lofty chair. Perhaps a difference in manners is an illustration of the greater conservatism of women who adhere to customs which have been discarded by the men. Vases of stone and earthenware, of bronze, gold, and silver, were plentifully in use. A vase of silver mounted on a bronze pedestal with 4 feet, which was dedicated to his god by one of the high priests of Lagash, has been found at Tello, and stone bowls, inscribed with the name of Gudea, and closely resembling similar bowls from the early Egyptian tombs, have also been disinterred there. A vase of Egyptian alabaster, discovered by the French excavators in Babylonia, but subsequently lost in the Tigris, bore upon it an inscription stating it to have been part of the spoil obtained by Naram Sin, the son of Sargon Akkad, from his conquest of the Sinaitic Peninsula. In Assyrian days, the vases were frequently of porcelain or perhaps of glass. When these were first introduced, that is still unknown. Various articles of furniture are mentioned in later contracts. Under Nabonidus, 7 shekels, or 21 shillings, were given for a copper kettle and cup, the kettle weighing 16 manes, or 42 pounds troy, and the cup 2 manes, 5 pounds 7 ounces troy. These were left it may be noted, in the safekeeping of a slave, and were bought by a lady. At a later date, in the 3rd year of Cambyses, as much as 4 manes, 9 shekels, were paid for a large copper jug and cooler, which was probably at the same form as the kulas of modern Egypt. The female slave, who seems to have started an inn in the 6th year of Cambyses, provided for herself with 5 bedsteads and 10 chairs, 3 dishes, 1 wardrobe, 3 shears, 1 iron shovel, 1 siphon, 1 wine decanter, and 1 chain, 1 brazier, and other objects which cannot as yet be identified. The brazier was probably a Babylonian invention. At all events, we find it used in Judah after contact with Assyria had been introduced, the habits of the Far East among the Jews. Like the sundial, what they call the gnomon of Ahaz, which is also seems to be of Babylonian origin. The gnomon seems to have consisted of a column, a shadow of which was thrown on a flight of 12 steps representing the 12 double hours, into which the diurnal revolutions of the earth were divided, and which thus indicated the time of day. What the chairs, tables, footstools, and couches were like may be seen from the Assyrian bas-reliefs, which were highly artistic in design and character, and were of various shapes. The tables or stands sometimes had the form of camp stools, sometimes 3-legged, but more usually they were furnished with 4 legs, which occasionally were placed on a sort of platform or stand. At times they were provided with shelves. Special stands with the shelves were also made for holding vases, though large jars were often made to stand on tripods instead. If we may judge from the old lists of clothing that have come down to us, the Babylonians must have been fond of variety in dress. The names of an immense number of different kinds of dress are given, and the monuments show that fashions changed from time to time. Thus, the earliest remains of Chaldean art exhibit 3 successive changes in the headdress, and similar changes are to be noticed in the dress of Assyrian kings, as it is represented in the bas-reliefs. To the last, however, the principal constituents of Babylonian dress remained the same. There were a hat or headdress, a tunic or shirt, and a long robe, which reached to the ankles, to which in cold weather was added a cloak. The hat or cap was made of some thick substance like felt, and was sometimes quilted. The Babylonian king Merodach-Nadin-Aki, who reigned around 1100 BC, is represented in a square cap, which is ornamented with a row of feathers. Below these is a band of rosettes. The Assyrian kings generally wore lofty tiaras. This was a survival of the tiara of the early Babylonians. Above his head was carried a parasol to protect him from the sun, but the use of the parasol was confined to the upper classes, if not entirely to the royal family alone. As for the tunic, that was made of linen, or more often of wool, which was manufactured in Babylonia on quite a large scale. It reached halfway down the knees and was fastened round the waist by a girdle. Under it, a second tunic or vest was sometimes worn in cold weather. Drawers were seldom used, though in the time of the Second Assyrian Empire, the cavalry and heavy-armed bowmen wore tightly fitting drawers of plaited leather, but the custom was probably introduced from the north. A bilingual vocabulary, however, gives a Sumerian word for this article of dress, which may therefore have been occasionally adopted in pre-Semitic days. The long robe was usually sleeveless and ornamented with a fringe. It opened in the front, and in walking allowed the left leg to be seen. The girdle was often tied around it instead of round the tunic. The Assyrian king is sometimes represented as wearing a sort of richly embroidered cape over the robe. The cape, or cloak, however, was specially characteristic of the Babylonians, as the Assyrians found it inconvenient in war or active exercise, and accordingly preferred to discard of it completely. Most of them wore it only on stately occasions, or when in full dress. Now, as for the feet, they were shod with sandals, though the Babylonians, as a rule, went barefoot. So also did the lower classes among the Assyrians, as well as a portion of the army. The sandals were attached to the foot by leather thongs, and the heel was protected by a cap. The boot, however, was introduced from the colder regions of the north before the 12th century BC. At all events, Merodach-Nadin-Agi is depicted as wearing soft leather shoes, and Sennacherib adopted a similar foot covering. This was laced in front like the high-laced boots with which the Assyrian cavalry were provided toward the end of the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. The priest was distinguished by a curiously flounced dress, made perhaps of a species of muslin, which descended to the feet, and is often pictured on the early seals. Over his shoulders was flung a goat skin, the symbol of his office, like the leopard skin that was worn by the priests in Egypt. In the early Babylonian period, the dress of all classes was naturally much more simple than that of a later date. The poor were contented with a short kilt, the king and his family with a long one. One of the early rulers of Lagash, for instance, is represented as wearing only a skull cap and a kilt which reaches nearly to the ankles. It was under the Semitic empire of Sargon of Akkad that the long robe seems to have first become common. But it was worn over the left shoulder only, and as the tunic was not yet introduced into ordinary use, the right shoulder was left completely bare. Even Naram-Sin, the conqueror of Sinai, is depicted as clad in this simple costume in a bas-relief that was found near Diyarbakir. The robe is quilted, and on the king's head is a conical cap of felt. The statues of the age of Gudea also show no sign of the tunic. The development out of the kilt must belong to a later age. The costume of the women does not appear to have differed from men that much. Both alike adopted the long robe, but representations of women are unfortunately rare. The queen of Ashurbanipal is dressed in a long and sleeveless robe, over which is a fringed frock reaching to the knees, and over this again a light cape, also fringed and embroidered with rosettes. Now, this may, therefore, be regarded as the official dress of a grand lady in the closing days of the Assyrian Empire. Both men and women were fond of jewelry, and adorned themselves with rings, bracelets, earrings, and necklaces. The women also wore anklets, like many of the Oriental women of today. The men carried a stick in the street, and all who could afford it had a small engraved cylinder of stone attached to the wrist by a ring, which passed through an orifice in the cylinder. The cylinder served the purpose of a seal, and was constantly required in business transactions, like a signature of sorts. No deed was valid without the seal or mark of the contracting parties. When either of them was too poor to possess a seal, a nail mark was impressed upon the clay of the contract tablet, and a note added stating to whom it was that mark belonged to. The seal cylinder was a Babylonian invention. In a land where there were no stones, while every pebble was of great value, and the Babylonians accordingly became expert gem cutters, even at a very early period. Gem cutting, in fact, was a highly developed art among them, and the seal cylinder of Ibn Saru, the librarian of Sargon of Akkad, which is now in a private collection in Paris, is one of the most beautiful specimens of art that has ever been produced. The pebble was cut in a cylindrical shape, and various figures were engraved upon it. The favorite design was that of a god or goddess to whom the owner of the seal is being introduced by a priest. Sometimes the king would take place of a deity, and at other times it was the adventures of Gilgamesh, the hero of the great Chaldean epic, that are represented upon the stone. The design is usually accompanied by a few lines of inscription, giving the name of the owner of the seal, as well as that of the father, and stating of what god or king he was the servant of. The seals were often kept in stock by their makers, a blank space being left for the inscription, which was to be engraved upon them as soon as they had found a purchaser. Hence it is that at times the names have never actually been filled in. The style and pattern of the cylinder changed in the course of centuries, as well as the favorite materials of which it was made. Under the dynasty of Ur, which preceded that of Hammurabi, for instance, hematite was more especially in vogue. In the age of Nebuchadnezzar, crystal had become a lot more fashionable. At one point, moreover, or among the artists of a particular local school, the representation of a human sacrifice was more common. Between the inscription on the cylinder, however, and the subjects engraved upon it, there is seldom, if ever, any connection, except when a portrait is given of the god or king of whom the owner calls himself the servant of. A hole was drilled through the length of the cylinder, and through this a string was passed. Instead of the string, a rod of metal or ivory was often employed. This was fixed in a frame of gold or bronze, and the cylinder was thus able to turn upon it. When the seal was used, it was rolled over by soft clay, leaving an indelible impression behind. Among the objects found at Telo are balls of clay, which were attached to papyrus documents like the seals of medieval deeds, and sealed with the cylinders of the postmasters of Sargon and Naram-Sin. Above the seal comes the address, in one case to Naram-Sin, in another to the high priest of Lagash. It is evident that a postal system had already been established between Lagash and Agade, or Akkad, the capital of Sargon's great empire. The impressions show that the seals must have been very beautiful specimens of workmanship. They all belonged to high officials, one to Dada, the seer of the palace, another to a high priest of Lagash himself. Great attention was paid to the hair of the head and beard, but this was more especially the case to the Sumerians, who were a bearded race of people. The older Sumerian population had but little hair upon the face, And at last, the typical Babylonian was distinguished from the Assyrian by the great absence of a beard. The result was that while the Semite encouraged his hair to grow, the Sumerian shaved it, except in the case of old men. Most of the Sumerian heads, which have been discovered in excavations of Dello, have smooth faces and shorn heads. The figures represented on the so-called Stela of the Vultures, one of the earliest examples of Chaldean art, are all without beards. And on the early seal cylinders, the gods alone, as a rule, are permitted to wear them. We are reminded of the Egyptian custom, which forbade the beard except to the king and god. In fact, the barber occupied an important position in ancient Babylonia, and the old Sumerian code of laws enjoins that a son who denies his father shall be shorn and sold as a slave. With the rise of Semitic supremacy, however, there was a great change. Naram-Sin, in the bas-relief of Diyarbakir, wears a beard and whiskers, and a mustache like the Assyrians of a latter day. And like them, he also has hair that is artificially curled, though it is to a lesser extent. The same long beard also distinguishes Hammurabi in a piece of sculpture in which he is entitled, I quote, "The King of the Land of the Amorites." Well, the gods, too, now assume a mustache as well as a beard, and take upon them a Semitic character. The use of cosmetics must have been widely spread, and many of the small stone vessels in which they were kept, and which have been found on the sites of Babylonian cities, were doubtless intended for the hairdresser. The oil that was poured upon the hair made it bright and shining, and it was worn long, whether it grew on the head or on the face. The Babylonians had long been known as the people of the black heads, perhaps in contrast to the fairer inhabitants of the Kurdish mountains to the north, and the black hair, frizzled and curled, was now allowed to be visible. The working classes bound it with a simple fillet. The wealthier members of society protected it with caps and tiaras. But all alike were very proud of it. The days were past when a beardless race held rule in Western Asia. And once again, we reach the end of this installment about Babylonia and Assyria. I want to thank my top-tier supporters and patrons: Dark, Carey, Kimberly, Ember, Ben, Britt, Charles, Erin, James, Jeffrey, Melissa, Scott, Stark Factory, Wendy, Jaden, Sherry, Jessica, Christine, Sally, Catiano, Christine, Fazabo, Legitimus, Maverick, Susan, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Cameron, Alexander, Nicholas, Daniel, and JR. Thank you kindly. And I will see you in the next exploration into ancient Babylonia. Oh, we are having lots of fun, aren't we? Well, at least I'm having fun. I assume you're having fun if you're still here. Alright, everyone. As always, as usual, lots of love to you all. Goodbye for now.